Welcome to Davenant Discussions. I'm joined once again by Stephen Wedgeworth, and we are trying to ask the question, is there a great tradition? And if there is, what is it? And part of the reason why is it seems like in the last few decades, the term great tradition has been used in theological writing to say that this is a body of teaching that we can retrieve from the past that if you retrieve it, use it, embody it, makes you part of, quote unquote, the great tradition. Before we kind of jump into the context of Stephen Wedgeworth, I just want to share on my screen basically this Google Ngram viewer thing. And it tells you, based on its uploading of all these books over the last 500 years, how often the term great tradition has been used. And it looks like, if you look at this chart, it really only begins to be used in the 1900s, and in particular in the 1930s and 40s is used. We'll talk about this. This seems primarily through the writings of those who are talking about the great tradition in terms of a literary corpus for English departments. And then only in the 80s and 90s and thousands is it used at maybe a higher level. And you wonder, is that because it's expanded into theological discourse? So whatever else you want to say about the term great tradition, based on use, it's a relatively new term, but it may, of course, speak about a very old idea. With that said, I will stop sharing this, and I can ask Stephen if you want to give some context.
Yeah, well, I also was just thinking about that chart. You didn't put an article in front of it. You just put great tradition. And I think that some of this conversation really is going to depend on that article. Are we talking about a great tradition? Are we talking about the great
Mm.
tradition? So yeah, some of this comes up in the broader retrieval and resourcement project, something that's near and dear to Davenant Institute. And I'm not sure if we have used that language, the great tradition. If we have, I don't think we intended to, add all of the weight to it that it might have. I think our interest is in tradition broadly. But the last decade or so, there have been people using that expression, the great tradition, to indicate almost another sort of canon. So, if they're Protestants, they're still going to hold on to sola scriptura, but there's still this idea that the great tradition is kind of the benchmark for if you are a normal traditional Christian, or are you some sort of modern spinoff or idiosyncratic Christian? And some of these arguments would go so far as to say that, everyone was swimming in the great tradition until, and then they'll have a marker and they'll disagree over what time the break happened. So some people say the Reformation was the problem. Other
Mm.
people will put it in maybe the 18th or 19th century, the Enlightenments and Industrial Revolution. Some people might push it all the way up to into the 20th century when things really fell apart. Um, but often that language, the great tradition, it serves that function. It's kind of the time in which everyone was more or less on the same page. They were getting things correct. The basics of all Christian faith were good and sound. And then when you depart from the great tradition, that's when you get into trouble. So that's kind of the concept I think we want to look at more closely today.
Yeah, and to kind of verify that with the text, I'm just reading Craig Carter's book, Interpreting Scripture with the Great Tradition. And on page 11 of the preface, he says, quote, "The great tradition of Christian orthodoxy begins with the Old and New Testaments, crystallizes in the 4th century Trinitarian debates, and then continues through Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, the leading Protestant reformers, post-Reformation scholasticism, and contemporary conservative, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestant confessional theology." And I'll just read the next 2 pages later. Page 13, he says, the Christian Platonism of the great tradition was developed in order to express the metaphysical implications of the doctrine of God that emerged from pro-Nicene scriptural exegesis in the 4th century. And as a result, the exegesis, the dogma, and the metaphysics are all intertwined together. So he would include in the great tradition something called Christian Platonism, as well as Nicaea, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, leading Protestants, and so on. So it is
Uh-huh.
it is sort of a canon, and it's fairly inclusive. And I will note there's a footnote that says, for more on the contours and importance of the great tradition, see Odin, Thomas Odin, Rebirth of Orthodoxy, especially pertinent to the present book, is chapter 7. And I looked through chapter 7 before this, and it was interesting to me that Thomas Odin uses the language classical or orthodox, and
Uh-huh.
at least at one point he'll use paleo orthodox as well. I don't actually think he uses the term great tradition, Thomas Odin.
Hmm.
He might
Yeah.
in some other book, or I just didn't notice it. But so then whatever else this idea is, it's not the great tradition. Like you could express it by saying Orthodox or classical Christianity. It seems like that's what Thomas Odin is doing.
Right.
So it's a bit maybe slippery for that reason.
Yeah. Yeah, classical is a tricky word because we do use that a lot. I mean, I will sometimes talk about the version of Anglicanism that I like. I'll call it classical Anglicanism. There's a classical school movement, but we do have to be careful because usually that branding, classical, is given much later. It's given after the fact by people who don't believe themselves to be living in a classical era. And so they're looking backwards to a time in which they think it was classical. And, perhaps the most obvious example of this is classical music.
Right.
Classical music, that's not music from the 300s.
No.
That's not even music from the Middle Ages, really. It's music that we think of as Bach and Beethoven
Right.
and those people. So I mean, really, we're post Renaissance into the Enlightenment, more or less. But we call that classical. Um, Similarly, in economics, so people talk about classical economics or neoclassical economics. That's a kind of a time period um, that's probably much more modern than you're assuming.
Right.
So it's a tricky word. We have to be careful with it. It may not mean the same thing depending on what genre or discipline we're in. Is there such thing as classical Christianity? I think yes, in a very broad sense. The doctrine of the Trinity, that would probably have to be in the mix there. Probably the doctrine of the two natures expressed by Chalcedon, but even there, I've met people that are really big into, Saint Cyril and the church around Alexandria, and they're already starting to have issues with Chalcedon or Chalcedon. Sorry, I never quite know how I'm supposed to pronounce that. Um, and then, yeah, then once you get into things like debates between Anselm and Aquinas over whether the Trinity is natural or supernatural, when you get in debates between Scotus and Aquinas, nominalists and realists, when you get in debates between Protestants and Catholics, all of those people would probably want to call themselves classical at least to some extent, but they have pretty serious disagreements too.
Well, it seems to me that great tradition is sort of like classical in that it's a later judgment on
Yeah,
an earlier period. And there's all sorts of like philosophy of histories that kind of think this way. I mean, everyone knows about like like you have Iron Age, Silver Age, Golden Ages,
yeah,
Bronze Age. Or there's actually Indian philosophy, I think, has more like iron, silver, gold. Western description of past has like Bronze Age, Iron Age, so on. But all this, there's like different ways of viewing history. The Dark
yeah,
Ages are a great example. Are they really dark? Like, what do we mean by Dark Ages? And
yep,
so it can be all sorts of judgments. And so I guess the real question is, does the great tradition as a term mean anything different than the group of people that I most identify with today? I think that's
mm,
like a question to ask. And it strikes me that the people that I see most using it currently, although I could, there's lots of people who use it now, tend to be Baptistic in background.
yeah,
And part of the problem of being a Baptist in the 80s and 90s, especially those 2 decades, where a lot of the people were times where you went to seminary and so on, was that there was a pretty anti-traditional approach to the
yeah,
past. And I don't think you have that in most Lutheran, Anglican, or Presbyterian circles. Maybe a little bit, but not at the same level. So you kind of wonder if when you're Baptistic or low church evangelical, using the term great tradition is a way to help you just to say, we don't have a concept for this in our group because you kind of rejected other versions of it, like you described earlier, being a classical Anglican or a prayer book Anglican or whatever. So we need a term to describe what we mean by being Baptistic and rooted in the past. And the
Yeah.
great tradition is a useful word because it's already been used for, let's say, 70 years in literary circles. Why can't we use in theological circles to express a canon um, that is useful?
Yeah. I think that that's right. I think the idea of a classical body of literature, the classical canon, that's just an appealing concept. So, hey, if there's the great books, that's the classical body of literature that everyone, at least in the English language, should know. Can we use the same kind of way of speaking for Christian doctrine and conversation? That seems to be where they're getting it from. But I think you're right that it is also a reaction to people that came before them that were opposed to the tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So it might even be the case that there were critics who said, we think the tradition went badly astray. So it's not the great tradition; it's the quite naughty and bad tradition. But they're very forthright in using the language of tradition as a negative, and now you have people coming behind those folks saying, "No, no, no, the tradition you're rejecting, it's actually good. We need to get back to it." So maybe that's where they're finding the interest in the use of that type of language.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that kind of explains why it's emerged and why, like when I read Craig Carter, and in the context of what I was when I was reading him, I believe he's telling this kind of story, or he will anyways, about how he was sort of hoodwinked into a kind of more progressive type of Christianity, and really returned once he started understanding the sort of classical Christian thought, or whatever you want to
Yeah,
call it. So maybe for in his biography, the great tradition is the canon of Christians that are on the sort of right track.
yeah,
I haven't read Matthew Barrett's new book on the Reformation, but I understand that he kind of makes a similar type of argument
yeah,
that the great tradition is almost a canon of authors and ideas.
right. Yeah, and I did see the Richard Cross book review of that Barrett book. That was being passed around a few years ago, and I remember Cross, who he's a professor at Notre Dame. He made the point, yeah, that the book was overextending. It was trying to claim too much for the great tradition, um, or it was excluding voices which should also be in there. And of course, Cross is he's a SCOTUS scholar, but he was wanting to challenge the assumption that the great tradition equals Thomism,
Yeah,
and he wanted to
and
argue that actually there's a huge role for Scotists in the tradition.
I think Thomas Aquinas is a plays a big role in this story along with Augustine. I
Mhm.
don't know if the IRBS guys like James Dolezal and others use the term great tradition, but they would definitely be saying like Thomas Aquinas is a mainstream thinker in how we think about divine simplicity and so on.
Yeah.
And more or less you kind of got to get aligned with his presentation of it to be orthodox.
Mhm.
I just can't remember if Dolezal or others uses great tradition language, but that same sort of conceptual understand there's a canon of people and ideas. And I
Yeah.
think it's important just to to expand on this. And so who does get included? You could have so Craig Carter includes Eastern Orthodox thinkers today, but I noted that he didn't mention any Eastern Orthodox thinkers in his list, or those
Mm.
Eastern Orthodox thinkers go back to. So Gregory Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, Basil of Caesarea, Chrysostom, um, whatever of Iconium, whose name I can't remember right now. There's a number of people that you think maybe they should be in this list. Even some that are uncomfortable, like Gregory Palamas would be one example. Simeon the New
Yeah.
Theologian would be another example. Some of the Bolshevik leavers of the Russian Orthodox Church, like Sergei Bulgakov in recent history, like is he included in this?
Yeah, and I think that's a good question. Yeah, Bulgakov, I think, is probably one of the more fringe figures. I mean, he is
Yeah.
famous. He's has huge influence, but Yeah, I don't know that you could pair him up right alongside Thomas Aquinas, and
No.
have and Palamas for that matter as well. There are groups within Orthodoxy that are very insistent that Aquinas is bad news, and that Palamas is the solution to that.
Yeah, and there's even well, I don't think it's historically sound personally. There was a movement among many Orthodox in the mid to early 20th century that talked about the Cappadocian Fathers or Cappadocian Fathers as having a view of the Trinity that was more socially orientated, more
Yeah,
community orientated. And what I mean, I don't think that's true historically. I don't buy the arguments, but like in what's so is, do we exclude this from, like, how does that work when you have people like this who
yeah.
are part of Eastern Orthodoxy or whatever, and they are saying this is also part of what we are? So I think there's some kind of important questions to ask as well.
Yeah, and I think also those are good reasons to be cautious with this kind of language because that social Trinitarian presentation was very strong around the turn of the 2000s. Lots of
Yeah.
momentum, and it's really crashed out now. It's come
Yeah.
under serious criticism, and yeah, these days the tide tends to be in the other direction. So, yeah, we want to be careful with that. But Basil's an interesting character because I think it's Basil who writes the letter, the speech about how to use Greek literature and learning to students. Is that Basil? Um,
Um, I want to. Well, I don't know if it was him there, but that would make sense that it would be him. Maybe I figure him
yeah,
or his brother Gregory.
it's possible it's Gregory, but I think it's Basil. It's something like a letter to the young Christian students on the use of Greek wisdom. It may even say pagan wisdom. Um, and it's surprising because he's fairly negative on
Oh,
Greek wisdom. You would expect from the way the modern conversation is that Basil's going to be, plundering the Egyptians and celebrating all the strengths and the best features of this. He's actually very, very negative. He says, yes, take the good, but he's much more saying, watch out, be on guard. This is dangerous stuff. Similarly, worth knowing is in early Christian literature about abortion. So I wrote a chapter on this in the Protestant social teaching book. Basil is one of the figures who says we don't have any time for the ensoulment debate. Whether the soul is being put into the embryo at a later period after conception. He doesn't say absolutely yes or no. He just says we don't care. It's not relevant for our moral calculus. We don't permit abortion, and we assume that any abortion is the taking of the life. So Basil just not even interested in the ensoulment debate. Well, other people are. Augustine is, Aquinas is. In fact, um, there's a statement in a medieval council, Vienne, and it pretty much says that the hylomorphic understanding of body and soul is the truth. Like you have to hold to the hylomorphic view, and the hylomorphic view is directly implicated in the ensoulment debate because if you don't have a body yet, then you also can't have a soul yet. Those two have to kind of come along together. And so, in those early stages, when there hasn't been sufficient formation for people to declare such a thing a body, they were reluctant to say there was a soul there. Um, and so that was pretty entrenched in a certain kind of Thomistic thinking. I think even into the 19th century. I think you can find people writing about delayed animation pretty clearly and without any thought that they're being heretical.
yeah, and even early Jewish texts based on a chapter in Exodus, it defines a sort of an unformed and formed what we call
Right.
fetus today. So
Depends
there
on
are
the translation. Yeah, how you
depends on the
translate that.
translation. Yeah, so there's some questions there. It is interesting when you're bringing up the Cappadocians. That so Gregory of Nyssa. So his older brother Basil was trained in Athens. Greek wisdom. Gregory was not. He didn't have any. His family protected him from that. And
Mm,
yet, of the two, Gregory of Nyssa, the one who was maybe untrained in Greek philosophy, is often accused as being or often thought of as more of the philosophical brother, where
mm,
Basil is more the practical biblical. It's an interesting thing. I'm not really sure why that is. It just when you were talking, I kind of thought it'd be fun to bring up. In fact,
yeah.
Gregory has this dialogue with his sister Macrina on the soul, which is the Christian version of Plato's Phaedo. So Plato's Phaedo
Mm,
is the immortality of the soul. Gregory and his sister have a dialogue, and Macrina plays the role of Socrates, as it were, and he
mm,
plays the role of one of the interlocutors who are asking her questions, and he calls her a true philosopher, which
mm.
would be a relatively big statement to make in the late fourth century in a Greek-speaking world
Yeah,
where women didn't they could, but they were not always viewed favorably as philosophers, depending on where you were. It was a bit of an interesting shakeup. But I
sure.
think this introduces us to a question about the great tradition and how philosophical it is, or how theological or biblical, whatever it is, because you mentioned holomorphism, is the truth, for example. And when it comes to something as simple as divine simplicity, we might say, there are different ways of talking about it. I mean, the Bible's pretty clear. God created everything, so he's uncreated. So he's not a composition of uncreated and creature. That's straightforward. He's definitely spirit, according to the Bible, or Moses says, we heard a voice but saw no form in Deuteronomy 4. So he is spirit, John 4:24, and not matter. So it's not a composite of spirit and matter. Sure, straightforward. But then you have some other compositions, is it a composition of being what is it again? Being in essence? No. Whatever. Existence and essence. Is it a
Yeah,
composition of potency and actuality? All these sorts of questions. And you have to kind of admit these are more philosophical questions that are
yeah.
implications and interesting, but, you know, maybe unique to Thomas Aquinas to a degree, or unique to a particular idiom of doing theology. For example, Augustine will talk about God more or less as being all active potency, but he'll use different language and it's kind of more integrated in a narrative structure or whatever.
Hmm.
And I would argue that he's a very strong view of divine simplicity. So, kind of which version of divine simplicity is the great tradition? Is it the more straightforward Bible version or the more philosophically articulated one, which is true according to reason, but not necessarily revealed explicitly in Holy Scripture?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a great test point because that's been a doctrine that I think many people have wanted to defend divine simplicity. There've been a number of books trying to defend divine simplicity. Same thing with impassibility.
Yes.
And when the defenders kind of get their backs against the wall, they're being pressured. Okay, show me the Bible verses, make your case. One move is to just say, well, hey, this is the position of the church. Now, this is the traditional view, and if you don't hold it, then you are departing from
Right.
traditional Christianity. So it's kind of an appeal to authority. It's a bit of a power move,
Right.
um, and that doesn't mean that there is no great tradition just in and of itself, but it just means to be careful as to why you feel the need to invoke it. And, yeah, I think something like divine simplicity is basically gonna be there, the most, the most elementary understanding of divine simplicity does seem to be kind of in all of the major thinkers, but you can get into some weeds, you can get into some details that are very challenging. Um, again, I think Richard Cross has pointed this out that between Scotus and Aquinas, there are some differences on that question of divine simplicity. And Richard Muller has also made some statements to that effect in his post-Reformation Reformed dogmatics. When he gets into those discussions about the
Right.
doctrine of God and simplicity, he'll point that out. That even Reformed scholastic theologians, some of them leaned more Scotus, and some of them leaned more Thomist.
I was just peeking at the Westminster Confession of Faith, and yes, it does affirm God's simplicity, but it doesn't, work through the various forms of non-composition, right? So
Right.
it
It
does
says
seem to
without
me like,
part, right?
yeah, it was no parts,
Yeah,
passions, pure, a most pure spirit, and so on. So it's affirming simplicity, but not like in some sort of like these are the 7 things that he's not composed of way.
right.
And I think that's just important to me because even like I think Aquinas would argue there's a view of divine simplicity is more or less a philosophical teaching, not necessarily one revealed like the Trinity or something like that. He has probably a
Mhm.
more advanced way of putting it, but you know what I'm trying to get at. Like it's not that this
Yeah.
is like a surprising notion. So I don't know that I would say to someone, if you want to be part of the great tradition, you have to believe that God is not composed of potency and act, essence and existence, and some other ones. Although you for sure have to say he's not composed of body and spirit. You know what I mean? As God, like it's.
Right.
I think that's pretty straightforward. Now, I will qualify that because I know some of the early Christians in the late 100s will say God is a body, but they mean a material-less body. So this would be like
Yeah.
Tertullian, for example. I think in De Anima.
Yeah. But it's a very high level conversation, no doubt about it. And um, if you try to impose that even on the average clergyman, then I think that you're basically encouraging them to just kind of smile and nod without actually really having a full understanding and personal affirmation of the doctrine, because it's beyond what you would typically expect people to be capable and comfortable with. Um, Platonism, I mean, that's an interesting topic, right?
Right.
Does to be in the great tradition, do you have to be a Christian Platonist? Um, well, if there's all these Aristotelians running around, then that's automatically a potential problem. Um, I I do think that Platonism was widely used. It was appealed to as a very effective backdrop, but never uncritically. Um, I know that Lewis Ayres and Michelle Barnes have written on this question: Is Augustine a Platonist? And they argue you need to be really careful using that language.
Yeah.
Um, Certainly, Augustine is familiar with Platonism, is using the idiom and categories that would have been common among Platonists, but he's never simply taking Plato and regurgitating him. He's always making pretty important changes, and it may not even be the case that he's getting Plato direct. He might be just regurgitating arguments from previous Christians who
Yeah.
have already done this back and forth synthesis. And so it's not even an issue for Augustine. He's not saying like, "Do I use Plato or not use Plato?" He's just saying, "I'll use Cyprian, I'll use Tertullian. That's what I'll do."
Right. I mean, he would. He's friends with a famous Roman who translated Neoplatonist texts, so he would have known texts like that, and he would have read Cicero, Hortensius in particular, which had a Platonic type of thing. But one of the questions to ask on this bigger, so can we just back up on Platonism for 2 seconds and go right into the details? Um, Whatever else Platonism is, you could almost call it Pythagoreanism. Like Pythagoras is really, you know what I mean? Like he's actually kind of like the OG on this stuff. And what you're getting at is a way of viewing reality in which there's more than just the 5 senses. And so Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are doing that. Lloyd Garrison at the University of Toronto would argue, I think people would disagree with him, but he would argue that Aristotle is really a Platonist in all the ways that matter, in the ways that
Mm,
matter, not like in every particular. Okay, so that's like a big question. So, like when we talk about Platonism in the ancient world, I think it's more like we're asking the question, like, do you believe in Newtonian physics? You know what I mean? It's like it's not really like it'd be like me asking, do you believe in gravity, man? And you'd be like, no, I'm not into gravity. I'm more into flying apart from gravity. I'm like, what are you talking about? So it's not like a live question. I think a lot of the ancient philosophers are like that. There's obviously
yeah.
divergent points of view on providence, determinism, the meaning of intelligibles, whether or not intelligible is in the material thing or if it's whatever. But big picture, it's just kind of like gravity. Like you don't. So
Right.
when I think about this, like realism or whatever, what we're really getting is like, do you believe in gravity? That's a conversation. So I think I can back that up. So when Craig Carter talks about Christian Platonism, and I know him like we're friends, I know him really well. I know that he actually means something like this. He just articulates it in a very combative way, you might say, where I go, okay, well, fair, whatever. Now going back to Augustine, arguably he's really not a Platonist. Whenever he can, he shows that he disagrees. So he denies, on more than one occasion, Plato's theory of knowledge, his
Mhm.
theory that you remember or recollect in order to know intelligible things, and argues
Right.
for the light of reason from God, more or less, like image of God kind of stuff. And when he obviously doesn't believe in the transmigration of souls, obviously he doesn't believe in the ascent um, through the spirit to an intelligible existence apart from the body. He completely denies that reality and affirms the physical resurrection.
Mm,
And in many ways is completely at odds with the Neoplatonism of his day, because he thinks we move through and necessarily through created material things to know God in a way
right.
that doesn't make the material things bad, just
Right.
makes them in the order. Now I would say Plotinus doesn't, to be careful of Plotinus, he actually doesn't say material things are bad. Others, however, when you start reading that tradition, will imply that they're worse than. In fact,
Yeah.
Calvin will frequently, I can't remember who he's citing, it might actually be Cicero, where he talks about the body as a prison. He kind of cringe a little bit, like, okay, well. But he is, because of the body of death that we're carrying around from Paul, like
Yeah.
it's there as well. So I just want big picture on that. It is weird for me to say that Platonism is part of the great tradition, but realistically, all early Christians were part of a world in which realism was kind of like gravity. You know what I mean? Like there
Yeah.
were angels, demons, whatever.
Right. And you could think of analogous challenges, is geocentrism the position of the great tradition, or is it heliocentrism, and how much does that matter?
Right.
Or more, I think more relevant, Anzi Camel, friend of the program, he just recently published a really neat essay about Albert Magnus and Thomas Aquinas's theory of the heavenly spheres and how they were connected to earthly geographical locations.
Yep.
So if you live in a certain area, a certain nation, a certain region, um, you are linked with the heavenly spheres, and those spheres actually dictate your attributes and behaviors. And that actually plays an important role for Aquinas when he starts talking about politics.
Yep.
Because, if people in one area have a certain set of tendencies and attributes, strengths and weaknesses, then they are not going to do so well in other areas.
Hmm.
But it's not a genetic argument. It's not saying that this is like their DNA. It's because of their link to the heavenly realm. Um, so if we're no longer persuaded that the heavenly spheres have such an effect on people, then we really shouldn't use Aquinas's argument there for politics. We disagree with the foundation of it.
And I think we'd have reason to disagree with Aquinas on a great deal, many things, not the Trinity, and not on predestination, but other things. And so it is interesting. I would say, like, just as a funny anecdote, memory serves, Philip Melanchthon was scheduled to go to England for some meeting of the minds and didn't go because of astrological signs. So he just had like these really odd
Yeah.
um things that are, is that part of the great tradition? Like, well, in a sense, like people did believe in monsters in the forest and whatever else.
Oh yeah.
So there's
I mean,
something there. So
certainly we I don't know, like Craig Carter's position on cessationism and continuationism,
right.
but I think it'd be a very hard case to make that a strict cessationism is what you find in the great tradition. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, evidently not. Almost every, starting from Ignatius of Antioch in his letter to the Romans, and virtually everyone else has God speaking to them through a dream, like
yeah,
without fail, and it gives um not revelation that changes the Bible, but particularized things for them. So
yeah,
Ignatius is that he must die in Rome. Augustine has at least a vision of God at least once with his mother in Ostia. Gregory of Nazianzus, they all do in a certain way. So at least at that level. Now, I don't think they're going around like Benny Hinn, swinging around things and healing people, but
Right.
there is
No, there
definitely
was not the modern charismatic movement hadn't shown up yet, so
no,
it's a different expression. And at the time of the Reformation, they have to wrestle with that stuff, and they go, "Okay, which prophecies do we accept? Which do we not? How do we classify this?" I think it's, a guy named Durham in his commentary on Revelation, and before he gets started with the commentary, he has a whole introductory section where he just gives you his views on prophecies.
yeah,
And he basically says, like, if you get a revelation personally in a dream, like you yourself are free to act on that,
yeah,
but you're not free to give it any public authority. You can't hold other people to stuff like that. But he's having to wrestle with those questions because everyone's having these issues, but then they really don't know what to do with them. It's still a live debate over the significance of it.
yeah. I think that's if you mean by cessationism like the sort of Benny Hinn stuff, yeah, okay, yeah, that's not there at all. Almost not at all. Almost not at all. It actually kind of is there in certain respects, but not at all. Almost not at all. But you do have an unbroken idea that the Holy Spirit speaks to you, the personal, like that is so ubiquitous and so undeniable across all centuries. It's not even. I don't think you can question it.
Uh-huh.
Um, but kind of going back to this, yeah, so that could be part of the conversation. I do think there's still this big question of, okay, so the word "the Great Tradition" seems to come on to the scene in the 30s and 20s to describe a literary canon. Theologians apply it to a theological canon of authors and ideas, but it's authors and ideas, not authors or, because as we noted, Aquinas' ideas on all sorts of things the Eucharist, for example, we would probably
Yeah.
not want to go for. Or on, I mean, he's pretty chastened on Mary, I would say, but even so, we wouldn't want to go as far as him on Mary, even though he's doesn't go as far as others might.
Right.
But I think he's good on original sin, predestination, Trinity, kind of on justification. It's a bit wonky, but it's not
Yeah.
like if you get behind the concepts to the actual judgments, you're like, okay, I see what you're doing here.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and it's interesting the way that you feel comfortable um, making those observations right there. You could imagine, a Roman Catholic would say, "Well, that's just proof you're not in the great tradition anymore. You've chosen to take a step out of the great tradition." And so it shows you how this terminology is often um, it's often a debate about authority, about canon.
mm,
Um, I think it's right to say that there is a great tradition, like there is a great conversation.
mhm,
There's all these famous people who are respected and estimable, and there probably were periods in the 19th century where uh, Protestants were too quick to just kind of reject all of it. Say, "Hey, I don't even care. I don't want to read any of those guys. They're all bad." That's a problem. But um, when we correct that problem, I think we're still going to have to say it is a dynamic, fluid, elastic sort of thing. It's not. It's not a very strict, precise. Um, it's not one abstract truth. It's a collection of ideas, authors, arguments, and conversations.
the arguments is key to add too, because I mean, the Nicaea itself as a symbol is actually a symbol of prior biblical reasoning at a high
Mhm.
level. It's
Yeah.
not just a symbol of conclusions. I think that's a misreading of the Nicene Creed. If you just think of it as conclusions, the order of clauses and the order of I mean, the whole thing's really kind of based off 1 Corinthians 8, 4 to 6 in the structure. But even the order of clauses and the order they come in from God, then true God from true God, like all that kind of stuff is actually a biblical argument that
Yeah.
is clear and apparent in the prior decades of differences through the writers. And so you
Yeah.
actually see this actually a conclusion or a symbol of a big, broad pattern of arguments. So the great tradition, I suspect, is kind of used that way, although maybe not
Yeah.
always clearly expressed that way. And insofar as what we're talking about, I mean, of course, I believe in what Carter and Bear believe, the great tradition. Yeah, I like those guys they all mention, so I'm right there. But I think your caution's important. As a Protestant, one reason I want to be careful of the term great tradition is I want to be free to say there were a few centuries where the church was really, really wrong on something,
Mhm.
and that's fine. Like they're still my
Yeah.
people, but they're wrong.
Yeah.
You might say the doctrine of transubstantiation. When it remind me of the council that when it was first kind of made dogma or whatever in the
It
Roman
I
Catholic
think
Church. Was it
I think it's
1215?
Fourth Lateran is the first time it really gets enshrined. I could have which Lateran wrong. I think it's Fourth Lateran. And then Council of
Yeah.
Trent is when it's finalized forever.
Yep. But you can read a number of authors from like the 700s and 800s who are debating the nature of the Eucharist and how to understand the visible
Oh, yeah.
signs and signification. I have on my shelf, I'm gonna forget his name, John Scottus Erigena, who
Huh.
in his John commentary, for I think it's like John chapter 1, gets into this and is very clearly rejecting what we might call a transubstantiist view. And then you have a number of other kind of famous debates around this, as like Robertus and all these kinds of guys that are obscure but talk about these things. And you go, well, they obviously felt that there wasn't one way of viewing this. So,
Yeah.
in what sense, like, was the Eucharist part of what great tradition? You know what I mean? I want to
Sure.
say, I think the Eucharist means what it means according to Holy Scripture,
Mhm.
even when people get it wrong in the great tradition.
Yeah. A connected idea is a doctrine that we think is super important to the great tradition. So, sticking with the Eucharist, let's just say the idea that we feed upon Christ's body.
Mm,
We can explain what that means in many, many ways, but just keep that basic thing right now. I think that's pretty traditional, right? Like
yep.
the great tradition affirms that we feed upon the body of Christ in the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. Um, Still, even though that's a very strongly defended position of the great tradition, it doesn't follow that a passage that is commonly used to prove that doctrine, say John 6, it doesn't follow that the great tradition used that passage to prove that doctrine.
Good point.
And what I always love to do to kind of show this is Luther. Martin Luther, Mr. Is means is, right? Pounding the table. He does not read John 6 as a proof text for the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. He says that's not in view of that passage.
Right.
And so we just have to be careful because you could be so confident in the classical doctrine that we feed upon Christ's body, um, that when you get to John 6, you say, well, of course, that's what it means because the great tradition teaches us this. But actually, no, the great tradition doesn't always read John 6 that way.
No, I think that's incredibly helpful. And yeah, it just kind of makes you kind of put like, so one, on the one hand, I like the idea of the great tradition insofar as I've heard it defined. Yeah, of course, I agree with all that stuff. And yet I haven't really felt free to use the term because I don't know exactly what it's meant to include and what it will
Yeah.
include. Um, Maybe for me, like I would say more obviously, I'm a Christian, I'm a Protestant, the Western Church is that Reformed, not Roman Catholic, and I'm a Baptist, and then I'm a particular Baptist, and then I'm a particular Baptist that appreciates the First and Second London Baptist confessions,
Man,
and then you
you
kind
are
of dial down.
peculiar. You are
I'm a
peculiar.
peculiar people, yeah. And then even beyond that, I would say, despite that, I'm also part of a British Baptist tradition that is distinct in various applications of ecclesiology than an American particular Baptist tradition.
Hmm.
So like
Yeah.
I go all the way down this trail, and this doesn't, because even though I have a very high fence of my like intellectual categories, this doesn't mean that I have any problem with like sort of being friends with those who disagree with me. But at least the narrowing there is pretty clear. Like I'm
Yeah.
overly particular, but you
You
know
know,
exactly what I mean, or more
in
or
some
less.
ways, this language of great tradition, classical Christian, it's very similar to the word evangelical.
Yeah.
People say, "Oh, I'm an evangelical." Well, I kind of know what you mean, You're giving me some context, some clues here, but I don't actually know what you are and what you believe. We've got to get a lot more into the details there. There's a value in it because it gives you a big tent. It can include lots of people. For social matters, maybe it helps fill in more blanks. And maybe that's kind of what's going on with great tradition. Oh, okay, you're the kind of person that would want to know Latin. You're the kind of person who cares to read the church fathers and the medieval writers. You're going to be interested in philosophical systematics. You're not a biblicist or overly idealistic, romantic. Modern. Maybe that's what is happening here. It's signaling a set of dispositions and preferences and methodologies.
Yeah, I think so. It's this, and this seems to me like so. I'm teaching this course right now on the philosophy of history, and there's an interesting category. History deals all the contingent facts. So kind of what I went down, like particular a Baptist, then a particular, and then blah blah blah. And then a philosophy of history applies your mind to history and often tries to find a general kind of category, some sort of thing. And it strikes me that great tradition is more at that level. It's the conceptual idea. And then we're also talking about these contingencies of like, you're an ACNA Anglican who's classical because you like the formularies and the Book of Common Prayer and the whatever else you like. Am I just like so? There's different ways to get at your identity from the bottom up or from the top down. And maybe I would say this might be maybe a helpful kind of final piece of our discussion. If you're going to use the word great tradition, I think you need to do a lot of contingent historical work to feed in the judgments that you mean by that concept.
Yeah. I would be wary of using it um, in any but the most kind of popular and broad ways. I feel like it's the kind of code language that if I use that around an academic, they would immediately just shoot me to bits, right? They'd say, "Okay, buddy, you're stating more than you're into here." Um, So, yeah, I would be reluctant to myself use it too much. I think in the armchair way that we're doing, it can be helpful, kinda know what you're getting at. But, yeah, I would be reluctant to try to use it to accomplish much in the realm of actual theological argument.
Well, I think that's good. I think we kind of went through the discussion. So I would say, big picture, great tradition. All right. See what you mean by that. It's interesting that it comes from a sort of Baptistic corner currently today, although it's a bit broader than that. Um, I think you're pushing back on it slightly more than I am. I don't personally use it, but maybe I'm not against it. I think you just have to really do the work of contingent history
Yeah.
and make sure that it actually represents something clear and straightforward. And I think many people have attempted that. But you're right. I don't think I'd use it in an academic setting because it doesn't yet have that crystal clarity and usefulness in that sort of discourse, which suggests to me that maybe we need to put it on pause for a couple decades until we
Yeah. Well,
build
there's
things
a
out.
there's a meme going around, from a Tarantino movie where there's this German Nazi soldier, and he's making the 3 sign,
Oh yeah,
this way there's this way and then there's this way, right? And depending on which way you make the 3 sign, you're cluing people in whether or not you're German or you're British or American.
right.
And, that's kinda my fear here, right? If I say "the great tradition" in an academic setting, I will have kinda indicated
Oh,
my
I
my
see.
my
Yeah.
foreignness, my, like, "Oops, I just gave it away that I'm not really in this kinda group. I'm a guy who's trying to get into this group, and they're gonna spot me as a little bit of an imposter."
Amazing. As a Baptist, I can only think of biblical illustrations, so I think of it as a shibboleth, but I like it. I like that you as an Anglican, you go to culture and things like that. So it's
That's
very,
right.
very perfect according to our two traditions. Thank you so much, Stephen. This was helpful.
Alright, see you later, Wyatt.